All right, well, thank you for coming to this session on learning at the speed of JavaScript, how to catch up and keep up amidst rapid change, or the short version, learning how to learn more effectively and efficiently. As you said, my name is Jake Witcher, and currently I'm an associate software developer at a consulting group in Cincinnati, Ohio called Cultivate, and we work with businesses in the greater Cincinnati area developing custom software for them. I've been with Cultivate since April of this year, and this is my first professional role as a software developer. This was a career change for me. I had a 15-year career in retail merchandising before I got into software development. So around this time last year, this is what I was doing. I was setting furniture, the custom paint treatments there on the walls, that's my work, and that was kind of my day-to-day, traveling around to different stores and setting them up. But for a while, I had kind of been interested in doing something else, moving into a different career. I just didn't know which direction to go in. So last year, in March, I ruptured my bicep moving something that turned out to be a lot heavier than I thought it was while at work. And that meant surgery and about a 3 to 4 month recovery period. And during that time, I decided to look into web development for the first time, just to see what it was about, see if it was something that I could learn. And after about a month or so, I was hooked. Like I knew this was the thing that I wanted to pursue as my next career. So I started spending every night and as much time on the weekends as I could possibly spare learning about JavaScript, CSS, and HTML. And from that first line of JavaScript that I ever wrote to my first day on the job was about 10 months. And what I'd like to share with you all today are some of the lessons I learned along the way on how to learn more efficiently and effectively and quickly. So what does it take to learn quickly? Or to learn efficiently, to make sure you're not wasting your time learning things you don't actually need to know, and to learn effectively in a way that a week from now, a month from now, you still have that knowledge that you learned. We're going to be talking about 3 different areas that are some habits or techniques that you can use to learn more efficiently and effectively. The first is finding ways to develop just a very shallow knowledge of a lot of things. Secondly, we're going to talk about picking a few things, and in fact, really one thing at a time that you're going to really focus on and master. And we're going to talk about some techniques that you can use in order to master something new. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the importance of teaching others what you're learning, not just for their benefit, but actually it's going to help you learn what you're learning even more. So let's start off by talking about that first step, that broad but shallow understanding. So what I mean by this is the kind of stuff that you know, you're aware of. You wouldn't put it on your resume, but if a problem came up at work, you would say, oh, I know a library that I think solves that. I've not used it before, but I know about it and I know what problems it solves. That's the kind of knowledge we're looking at here. Nothing that you feel like you have mastered, but just something that you're aware of. Because if you take all the knowledge in the world and you divide it up into 3 containers, you're going to have one bucket of the things that you don't know, and then you've got another bucket of things that you at least know, you don't know, and then lastly, the bucket of things you know. And I like to imagine a 4th bucket of the things I think I know, but I really don't. But the goal of this first step is to take the information that you aren't even aware of, that's in that first bucket, and move it into the second. And to keep moving things over as much as you can so that you're reducing the amount of things that aren't even in your field of vision, and you're increasing the number of things that you're at least aware of. Now, the value of this is twofold. So the first one I've already kind of mentioned, and that's because when you come up against a problem that these ideas, techniques, frameworks solve, you'll be aware of them. You'll know what they are, and you'll know how they work at least a little bit, and you'll know to turn your focus to these things to learn them a little more deeply. But there's more to it than that. Having a very broad knowledge base, no matter how shallow that knowledge might be, also helps you learn new things. And I like to think of it as this spider's web of knowledge, where everything you know, no matter how superficially, is a node of knowledge. And each of these nodes are connected to other nodes through an association or a relationship. So when you're explaining, let's say you're a React developer, and you're trying to explain React to an Angular developer, you might say, well, it's like this thing that you do in these ways, but it's different in these other ways. That's an association, that's in a relationship. And when you build these knowledge nodes with relationships to other knowledge nodes, it makes it easier. The bigger that web is, the bigger that setup is, the easier it is to learn new things, because the quicker you can associate a new thing to something you already know, the more quickly you will retain it and remember it and be able to do something with it. So imagine you're learning Redux for the first time if you're a React developer, and you're seeing the reducer pattern for the first time. You've never seen anything like that before. That was certainly my experience. And the first time I went through the setting up of Redux, it sort of went in my head and right back out, because I had nothing to really connect it to. There was nothing I knew at that point in time that was similar. But by having a slightly broader set of knowledge, we find relationships, we find patterns, and it's much easier to be like, oh, okay, this thing they're doing in Redux, that's like this pattern matching thing that happens in Elm and in the Elm architecture. And the more of these things we have, the denser our web becomes, and the much more readily we catch new things and keep them, and they stick in our minds. So what are some resources and some ways that you can work on developing this superficial, shallow knowledge, but of a whole lot of things? Well, you can go to local meetups, and that's something that I spent a lot of time doing when I was first getting started, because at meetups, you can not only learn from the presenter, but you can also learn from other developers who are going as well. You can find out what tools they're using and how they're using them, and have conversations about these things. You're not going to walk away an expert, but you're going to be aware of a little bit more. You can use podcasts. In my previous career, I traveled a lot. Sometimes I was driving up to 4 hours a day. I listened to a lot of podcasts in that time. And the benefit of this was, while I didn't walk away an expert, and I certainly wasn't able to follow everything being said, it really gave me a nice foundation of things that libraries and techniques and things that I was aware of that I knew to reach for that still help me today in my professional role. You can look at blog posts. You can go to conferences. And you don't have to just go to conferences to listen to conference talks. Many, many conferences post their talks on YouTube. And I pretty regularly, even now, listen to conference talks on a regular basis, sometimes just in like 20-minute intervals during a commute. And again, you're maybe not able to take it all in or even look at the slides if you're just listening, but it's enough to learn from. And one thing I'd like to encourage you, especially if you've been in this business for a long time and you've been in a particular area for a long time, like if you've been in JavaScript pretty much your entire career, look for meetups and podcasts and blog posts that are outside that area, and look at back-end things, look at design-related things, perhaps even look at completely different disciplines, other engineering disciplines and sciences. The broader that knowledge base is, the quicker you start to recognize similarities and patterns as you learn new things. All right, and then lastly, books and API documentation. Now, these are kind of like reference materials that you often use as a one-off, like I need to know how this one thing works. But you can also use them to get like a general sense of something. You're not going to, again, walk away mastering it, because you can't read through a 600-page book on JavaScript or read through the entire documentation for a framework and walk away memorizing all of it and knowing exactly how to use it under all circumstances. But you'll at least have a better sense of where to go later. All right, so once you've developed some of these habits, and I'd encourage you to pick a few of these things if you aren't already and start incorporating them into your life with whatever works for your schedule, whether that's something you do daily, weekly, whatever works best for you. But once you have that as kind of a foundation, and you're kind of turn your attention to something you want to master, something you want to get really good at so that you can add it to your resume or so that you can use it on a production-ready product at work. The goal here is to focus on one thing at a time. I know when I was first kind of getting into this industry, there were so many shiny new things to look at. And it's really easy to kind of get started on one and then move on to the next and then move on to the next and really never develop an expertise in the things that you're trying to learn. And there's a place for that, but if your goal is to become an expert, to really master a particular thing, you want to stay focused. To determine what you're going to focus on, just ask yourself initially, well, what do I need to learn right now? And that might seem like an obvious question, but I know for me personally, so often I'm chasing things that I actually don't need in this moment, but it's just something that I might need later, or that sounds interesting to me someday. So what do you need right now? Because when you're trying to learn something that you currently need, it's really the motivation you need to keep moving forward, and it also keeps you focused so that you're not only just trying to master this one thing, but you're trying to master a particular use case for this one thing. And once you've identified that, start doing some initial research and looking at what is the 20% of this new library, this new language, this new framework that's going to get me 80% of the way to full productivity. So in the retail business that I came from, it was fairly common to have 80 or 20% of the items that you would sell make up 80% of your business. And then the 80% of stuff taking up space on your shelves in addition to that was only 20% of your business. And if you think about a library or even a language like JavaScript, the same is fairly true. Like, we don't use everything that JavaScript offers every day. There's probably a small percentage, whether it's 20 or 30, it's a small subset that as soon as you master that subset, you can do the vast majority of what you need to know. And so whenever you're trying to learn something new, you want to do a little bit of research to figure out what that 20% is. And then once you've done that, take that kind of smaller chunk and then you break it down into smaller steps, because the goal here is to only master one simple thing at a time. See, whenever we set ourselves to master a really complex thing and we try to take it in all at once, it becomes too much. It takes too long to go from knowing nothing to being an expert. And as a result, we either bail out along the way or we pick up bad habits along the way. We never quite get to the expertise we're looking for. It's much easier to learn a dozen small things really well than it is to learn one complex thing really well. A great example is preparing for a conference talk. I know when I first started practicing my talks, I'd try to practice the entire thing in one sitting and then go back and practice the entire thing again. Ironically, it was when I was preparing for this talk, when it hit me, I should be breaking this up into smaller parts. It's easier for me to remember and master just a 5-minute segment of my talk than it is the full 30 minutes, 45 minutes. All right, so when I give this talk, I like to use a current example, something that I have recently learned to sort of walk through these ideas. And so for me, while I was hired on initially to do front-end work, I ended up getting thrown into a .NET back-end position that required a lot of parsing to get some information that was needed for the project we were working on. And during this whole process, and sometimes parsing can be a little painful, I kept remembering this thing I had heard of called a parser combinator. It's a functional programming concept. And I remember thinking, I wonder if this would make this easier. So recently I thought, all right, I'm going to set about to learn this so that the next time we have this need, maybe I can build a tool that gets us what we need quicker and more readable by using this technique. So the first thing I did is I pulled up the official documentation. By the way, this is an F#. It doesn't matter for the content of this talk, but if any of this looks strange, it's because the examples are in F#. This was the API. This is a portion of the API. And of course, it's overwhelming when you first are going to learn something new and you see all there is to it. And it really doesn't matter what you're trying to learn, whether it's a new framework or a new library. There's just an overwhelming amount of things to learn. But after a little bit of research, looking at the tutorial on the documentation site and a couple other places, I was able to identify just a few things that looked like they made up the vast majority of parser functions that were created by this library. If you have access to examples of other people using this code, it's another good way to look for patterns and see what's being repeated over and over so that you kind of know what's the most important thing to learn to be productive in this new skill set. So this is a much more manageable piece of information to digest. There's only a dozen functions here to learn, and this is going to get me pretty productive in this new library that I'm trying to master. So at this point, I identify a first step. What's the thing I'm going to learn first? And in this case, it's really just two functions. There's one that's going to help me create a string parser, and there's one that's going to help me use that string parser against whatever it is I'm trying to parse. And from that, I make my first simple example. And if this seems really simple and straightforward, it is. And that's on purpose. Because you can master this in 10, 15, 20 minutes. And then build on that by taking the next piece and mastering it in 15, 20, 30 minutes, depending on what you're learning. And eventually, you very rapidly get really good at what you're doing. Now, that alone right there, I have found to be a huge benefit in terms of learning and learning quickly. It's just this idea of breaking things down into small things that you stick with, and you don't move on to the next thing until you've mastered it. But there's some more techniques that you can use to move toward mastery in a new subject or a new skill set. So the first thing I recommend is that you use resources only as needed. That doesn't mean resources aren't important, things like tutorials, documentation, things like that. But it means that the quicker you wean yourself off of them and start working with the new concept on your own, the better. The faster things are going to stick with you. And I know personally, I love a good tutorial. I can sit there and just follow along and type up what they're typing all day long and feel really good about myself. But the reality is, I don't remember things very well from doing that. I learn it, but then it's gone. So the quicker you move away from the resources and start using the thing on your own, the better. Secondly, be playful. In my fine arts program, my undergraduate degree is in fine arts, we call this directed play. A lot of people prefer exploration, experimentation, whatever you want to call it. Be playful with what you're learning. If the documentation says this is used for A, try using it on B and see what happens. Mix and match things in different ways, but explore, play around, give yourself that freedom, and you're going to find the strengths of what you're working with, you're going to find the limitations, the barriers, and you're going to understand it a whole lot better than if you only follow like the happy path of whatever the tutorial and whatnot is teaching you. So for example, coming back to this parser that just takes in this case I'm telling it this is what an opening tag to an H1 element looks like, and then it can run it against a string. Being playful might be as simple as saying, I wonder what happens if the string begins with white space. Will it still work? Yes or no? If not, what's the error message I get back? And then that kind of springboards into, well, then what do I need to learn to make it work? This kind of back and forth question and response, and in this case, it was a simple extra function and a very odd looking angle bracket operator, but that alone makes it work against something that begins with white space. And this back and forth process, when your education is a dialogue rather than you listening to an instructor and just receiving, things stick a whole lot better. You get really good at what you're doing much quicker. All right, and then make something yourself. So up until this point, I've kind of been talking about it as if mostly what you're doing is playing around, building up small code snippets, but it's important to actually build something much larger with what you're learning. And that might be the original use case that led you to learn this new technique or tool, or it might be something smaller, something easier to kind of do first before bringing it into your actual side project or work project. And the way I like to approach this is sort of take all of this together and wrap it up, is I like to find a tutorial or a series of blog posts that does walk me through building something. So in this case, on the official documentation website for this parsing library, there's a very simple JSON parser tutorial. And so then I create a project of my own that's similar but different from the tutorial project, in this case, an HTML parser. And as I'm working through the tutorial, I start with step one. In this case, step one was just learning how to define types in F# and in this library. So okay, I learned that, I play around with it, I get comfortable with it, and then I do that on my own. I break away from the tutorial, and I do it again in my own project. And I repeat this step. The tutorial project shows me how to create a simple parser. I then go to my project, and I make a simple parser. The tutorial project shows me how to combine it all together into something bigger. I go and do the same. There's two benefits here to doing it this way. The first is just simply repetition. You're doing something once, and then you're immediately turning around and using it again. But the other benefit here is that it comes back to that idea of breaking down what you're mastering into a small piece, and then as soon as possible breaking away from the resource and using that small piece. Typically, the idea, you might normally go through the tutorial from start to finish, and by the time you're using it on your own, you've already forgotten what the first step was or how to do it. I know that was certainly my experience in setting up my first Redux store. I did it, and then later I came back and I couldn't remember how to do it. So the next time I was working with it, I did this exact same thing. I set up a store in one project, I set it up in another project. I then started working on it in the next step, and then back to the same next step. And that obviously makes it take longer to get through the tutorial. But again, we're not just talking about quicker learning, that's important, but also effective learning. It actually sticks and you can use it later and you don't have to keep going back to the beginning over and over again. All right, then when possible, look at quality examples of what you're trying to learn. Now, I found that this can vary depending on what it is you're trying to learn. Sometimes those examples are out there and they're easy to find. Other times, not so much. When I was learning React, it was relatively easy to find examples, at least small examples of React applications that I could look at their approach and what they were doing. Learning this parsing library, I had a harder time finding people using it the way that I was using it, and I wasn't really able to do that. But if you can, try to find examples of people doing it really well. And then lastly, context switch if you can. So context switching is when you take something that you're learning in a particular context and in a particular environment, and then you try to relocate it and use it in a different environment. So for example, as Tanner mentioned, I am a functional programming enthusiast. I love functional programming. I discovered it very early on in my JavaScript journey, and it has just been a passion of mine ever since. But it was a struggle first learning some of those concepts. But once I got relatively comfortable with it in JavaScript, I spent about 2 to 3 weeks programming in Elm, a purely functional language that uses those same techniques, but in sometimes similar ways, sometimes different ways. And when I came back to JavaScript and started trying to apply those techniques again, I understood them so much better because I had seen the bigger idea in two different contexts. That's, I think, a really good example of it. Sometimes it's hard to find that kind of big of an extreme context switch. Another example would be like when I was learning TypeScript. The first few times that I used it were in React applications. But at one point, I switched over and built sort of like a vanilla TypeScript application that was just HTML, CSS, and TypeScript. And I ran into new problems, different problems that I hadn't run into in the React app that helped sort of solidify what I had already learned about the language and also taught me new things that I hadn't learned before. So once you have kind of taken up this path of mastering something new, the next thing that I would really encourage you to do in order to truly understand it at a whole other level is to start teaching what you know to other people. There's nothing like teaching what you have learned to solidify what you've learned, to expose holes in your understanding, things that it turns out you didn't know as well as you thought you did. For a long time, I was blogging pretty regularly, and one of the best parts of that is I would learn something new, I'd start writing about it, and I'd write up the little code example that I was going to use, and I'd run that example in my editor, and it wouldn't work. And I'd realize, oh wait, no, I thought it worked like this, because it did in this situation over here, but in my little example, that's not quite the case. And the next thing you know, your understanding is much, much deeper. And teaching can take on all kinds of different forms. So if you're thinking right now, well, I'm not really comfortable standing in front of people at desks in a classroom and talking with them about how to do something, this can take all sorts of different forms. You can write articles and blog posts, and that's one of the things that I did for a while. You can also create video tutorials, and there's quite a few people who do this as well. But if you're not comfortable with those things and you really just enjoy building software, you could build an educational application. And the example I like to point to kind of hopefully inspire people in this direction is there's a man named Dave Geddes who has created a game called Flexbox Zombies and a bunch of others. And what I love about what he made is it is an application that teaches you something. But I've heard him speak on a podcast before where he talks about how much better he understood Flexbox and CSS Grid and service workers just through the act of creating these projects. And yours doesn't have to be something at that same professional level. It can be something simpler. But build an application that teaches what you're learning to someone else who's interested in learning. You can start a repo of examples to share. So this is something I've added to this recently because every single time I give this talk, I mention how hard it is to find examples sometimes for certain libraries or certain tools and techniques. Start a repo. Put yourself in that position of the learner while it's still fresh. You remember what you wish you had had when you started, and build an example that is that. Or create a repo that's sort of like iterative examples, where you're taking this new tool, this new technique, and you're saying, this is what it looks like at a small scale, this is what it looks like at a larger scale, and so on. You can also speak at meetups and conferences. This is, of course, what maybe a lot of us think of when we think of teaching, standing in front and talking. But I highly encourage you to look into this if it's something you think you'd be interested in or have never tried before but are interested in trying something new. You can pair program with other developers with the intention of teaching what you're learning. So if you've just learned some new technique or some new tool set, see if a friend or a coworker would be willing to sit down with you for 20, 30 minutes. Let them be at the keyboard and you talk them through how to use this new thing. And in talking through and in that dialogue, you're going to learn a lot more about that tool set than probably what you did in the time of just learning it on your own. And along kind of those same lines, you could start a study group, either at work or again with a group of friends, where you have a group of people, however many, who just kind of commit to this idea of we're all going to be learning something, either the same thing or all learning unique things. And once every so often, a week, a month, we'll get together and we'll present what we're learning. And just a simple, quick 5-10-minute presentation. But the time you'll spend preparing for that and thinking through how you would explain it to people is, again, going to help solidify what it is that you're learning. And if you happen to be in a group where everybody's learning something different, you're going to be doing two things at once. You're going to be learning something very deeply and mastering it to share with the group, and then you're going to be expanding your sort of like shallow but broad knowledge by hearing what they're learning. And if you incorporate these things in your day-to-day or week-to-week, again, whatever time frame works for you, taking time to make sure you're broadening your kind of shallow knowledge base, and make sure you're taking time to master one thing really, really well. and then making sure that you take that knowledge and share it with others so that not only do they benefit from it, but you're going to continue to grow in what you're learning as well. You're going to find that your ability to learn new things increases greatly. You're just going to be much quicker. It's going to become a lot more effective and a lot more efficient use of your time. And that's it. Thank you.